Hi everyone. This tutorial will show you how to use image trace in Adobe Illustrator to make a live scan drawing similar to this one. I'm going to close out of this and show you the process quickly from start to finish. We're going to start with a photograph of the object, and the best thing to do is to take your photograph on a high contrast background. It's very easy to get the scan drawing when you have the object isolated from the background. So these moments in this photograph are great because there's a really sharp edge, and I could, if the whole photo was like this, I could bring it right into Illustrator. But you can see that I only have a white background for part of the image, so I need to go into Photoshop and clean this up. After the cleanup process, the image should look something like this. And I'm not going to go through the whole process of cleaning it up, but I'll show you the basic tools. So I'm going to open the first image with Photoshop, and I'm going to zoom in, Control plus on the image, and look at the parts that I need to cut away. Over here in the lower left-hand corner, I'm going to make sure that my background is set to white. And in the upper left-hand corner here, I'm going to find the polygonal lasso tool. In certain places where there's not a lot of contrast between the edge, I need to come in, and again, you can decide how much resolution you need. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect for what we're doing. So for what we're doing, a medium distance from the object is probably fine, and we're going to just left click a series of backspace if I want to undo, left click and find the contour. It's best to do this in chunks, and then hit delete and make sure that when you fill, you're filling with the background color. So delete will enable the fill command and then set it to background color. If your background color is white, hit OK, and then you're going to cut that away. So what I did here was, again, you can trace chunks, and then I come around, and when I'm happy with the selection, I can double left click to close the selection and then hit delete, and that gives us the background color. Okay, so now there are also some other tools that we can use here that will speed up parts of the image. Under lasso, if I left click and hold, I will find the magnetic lasso tool, and I'm going to just drag that. I'm not clicking anything. I'm just dragging magnetic lasso along the edge, and where there's sufficient contrast with the image, it's finding that. Now it lost the contrast, but then you can also click, and then you can also double left click to close the selection and then hit delete. And so that speeds up things quite a lot in areas like here, for example. I can use the magnetic lasso because it's finding that high contrast edge really quickly. Oops, backspace to undo. It's losing it there, then I can kind of get it to work. Yeah, keep going. And then I know when I hit this shadow, it's going to drop off because it's not going to be able to find the edge. So I'm going to go ahead and keep that and hit delete. And through a combination of magnetic lasso and the one above it, polygonal lasso, I'm going to carve out, or cut away rather, the parts of the image that I don't want. So Control minus will zoom out. And at the end of the process of cutting all of this stuff away, I should have an image like this one. And that's what we're going to bring into Illustrator. So we'll do that now. When you save, make sure in Photoshop not to overwrite your image. You're going to save this as either another JPEG, or I also like to use PNG, the PNG format. So you can see that I saved my isolated hairdryer image as hairdryer isolated PNG. PNG is great because every time you save a JPEG, it loses a little bit of quality. That's not the case for a PNG. So I save this as a PNG. Just a tip for going forward. All right, I'm going to close Photoshop, and I'm going to open Illustrator, and I'm going to create a new drawing. And I want this, by default, you might be in points or picas. You want to change your units to inches. And our drawing will be 12 inches by 12 inches. There's no DPI by default, really, because unlike Photoshop, we're mostly dealing with vector information in Illustrator. So once I have the correct size, I'm going to hit Create. And it's going to open the drawing. If I want to see that the dimensions are correct, I can, on a Windows machine, hit Control-R, and Control-R will turn on the rulers. So Control-R toggles on and off the rulers. To put the image into Illustrator, I just need to pull up the folder where the image is living. I did. Okay, and I want to drag it in. And then if it seems a little too small or a little too big, I can resize it a little bit and position it on the page where I think I want it, and that looks pretty good. Maybe I'll bring it down just a little bit. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Okay, I'm going to do a couple. You can see that when I select the image trace now becomes available in the upper left-hand top menu bar here. I'm going to hold off, and I want to make 2 copies of this and put them right on top of each other because I'm going to do the image trace twice to get the drawing that I showed you at the beginning of the tutorial. To do this, I can Control-Z, Control-V, and now you can see that I have 2 copies. The edge is white. It's going to be a little hard to position them right on top of each other. In fact, oops, I didn't mean to delete that one. If I Control-C, Control-V, yeah, it offsets them a little bit. So we don't want that offset. We want them positioned right on top of each other. If I select one of them, I can pull down. So if you just click on the ruler, that's why rulers are also important, you can just drag down a guide. And if I click on the left, if I select the object and then drag from the left ruler, I'm dragging out a guide, it's going to find the edge if I have the object selected. So now I have these guides, which is great. And I can now bring this other image, and it will find that snap to the guides, and I can put them right on top of one another, which is great. But now I want to put them on different layers. So I'm going to go to Window, and I'm going to turn on my Layers menu. Where are you? It popped up on the other screen. So here are my layers. Right now I have one layer. I'm going to click this Create New Layer button here. Now I have a second layer. And to move one of the photos to the layer, I'm going to select the top one, and you'll see that there's now a little blue box that appears in my Layers tab. I can left click that and drag it up one layer. And now if I just, very similar to Rhino, I have these eyeballs which I can use to toggle on and off the visibility. So if I toggle on layer 1, that shows me that I have an image. If I turn that off, everything goes blank. If I toggle on layer 2, it shows me that I have an image. So that's great. Now I have 2 layers on 2 images on 2 different layers. So let's do the top image. I'm going to do layer 2, and so this is going to be dark outline. And then the other one we will make our contour. Okay, so let's start with the dark outline. I want to make sure that I've got this layer on and it's selected. I'm going to select this object. And then instead of using image trace here, I'm going to pull out the full window by going to the window menu, and I will find image trace. Great. Okay, now I select this object again, and you can see that image trace is live here, or this is working. By default, it might be on this black and white setting. Let's start with that. That's good for what we want to do. And let's do a couple of things. We will click Ignore White. That way it won't draw the outline of the overall image. And we're going to click on Preview. And Preview is going to give us an interactive tracing. It may, because of the resolution of the image, give you this warning. Tracing may proceed slowly with this large image. Just hit OK. The computers that we have at school should be powerful enough to do this. Okay, now you can see that we have this very cool high contrast black and white drawing. And we're going to use this to get the outlines. We can use this technique in lots of different ways. I'm just showing you the way that we're using it for this assignment. Once we have this, we could play around with it. We could play around with a threshold. We could play around with a number of paths. By default, it's at 50%. Let's see what happens if we take it down to 20%. What does that do for us? Since we have on preview, it should automatically update. It doesn't look very different. If I take it up to maybe 75%, does that give us a change? Doesn't look very different. So let's just keep it at 75% for now. And now we want to break the link between the image and the paths. So up on this top menu bar, there is a button that says Expand. Let's hit Expand. And now we have the tracing. These are all filled in paths by default. What we want to do is turn them into lines. And we can do that by coming down here to the lower left side menu bar. And so by default, you will probably see a white fill and a black stroke. If we just click that, or if we click the default, this little default button, it's going to give us something like this. And now we have paths which are black outlines with white fills. We actually want to get rid of the white fills, so we want to make sure that the fill is on top down here by clicking the fill box. And then just below the stroke box, there's this little white square with a red line going through it. Click that. It won't look any different, but now if something's under this object, we'll be able to see it. It gets rid of the white fill or hatch, if you will, underneath that. Okay, so we're done with this for now, and we're going to turn this one off. Now we're going to turn on contour or contour layer, or whatever you've named the second layer, the one underneath. We're going to select the image again, and we're going to change our tracing mode from black and white to grayscale. And let's just stay with the defaults. Let's again click Ignore White and Preview. And let's see what happens here. It's giving me this same tracing may proceed slowly. I'm going to click OK. It's clearly energy intensive, computationally intensive. Okay, now it just looks like a black and white photograph, but in fact these are all filled in paths to the tune of, let's see, we have 50 layers of 50 shades of gray here. Let's bump this up to something higher resolution. So let's hit 80. Oh, you can see that it's crunching this. Smoothing the paths. Okay, cool. So now we're done. with this image trace, I am just going to close this dialog box. And again, if you need to get that back, just go back to Window and turn on Image Trace. And now I want to expand this, so that flattens it. And I am going to make sure that I'm going to delete these guides. Now I'm going to select this object. So I'm going to make sure that everything's selected here. And again, I want to come down. We have different types of grays here, so it might give you a question mark, but basically I just want to hit the default fill and stroke, and then again hit none for the stroke. And now you can see I have all of these contours. What I want to do is select them again, and by default you should up here have when I select the paths, some options. And I want to take the stroke weight from 1 point to something, make it much lighter, maybe like 0.25. So now you can see it's really light. And if I turn on my dark outline, oh, something's not showing. So let's troubleshoot that. Let's turn off our contour. Now if I select this path, I can see down here that for some reason I didn't unfill that path. I thought that I had, but I'm going to select everything. I'm going to make sure that the fill is on top, and I'm going to click this None button. Now when I turn on the contours, you can see that I can see all the contours underneath. Okay, I'm going to turn off the contours for a second. I think that this line weight is a little too heavy, so I'm going to bump this down to 0.5. Maybe I'll make a custom 1.6. And then turn on contour, and that's starting to look pretty interesting. Maybe I want to, oops, turn everything off, bump this back up to 0.75. That looks good. That looks quite good. Okay, let's say, I'm going to zoom in on this. Let's say I wanted all of these little smaller contours to be dashed. How would I do that? Just to give the drawing more texture. I'm going to turn off the dark outline. I'm going to first, over here on the left-hand side, I should have this menu, and there's a little expand panels button here. I could dock my layers now that I have these panels expanded. Dock my layers down here next to the artboards. Now I want to select all of these paths, and if I go to this stroke panel here, by default I should see dashed line, and if I click that, by default it will be 12 point. So it'll look something like this, like that, which might be what you want, or we could change it to 2 point. So just hit 2. You could have a custom gap, so you could do 2, 5, 2. You could put in any rhythm that you want. We're keeping things simple. Now I'm going to turn my dark outline back on. There we go. Clicked it off by mistake. There's a little bit of a lag here because there's a lot of data. So that's looking pretty interesting. We'd have to print it to see if this looks good on the page. If I want to modify one of my outlines here, so let's say I want to modify this price tag. By default, so let me just turn off the contour for a second. By default, when I select this price tag, everything is selecting. If I then right click, I can ungroup it. Now I'm still selecting everything, so let's right click again. There's another command called release compound path. I'm going to click that. Now I can get that path. So perhaps I want that to be a slightly less line weight. So I would take that down to 0.5. Maybe I want this big outline and this outline to be a little beefier, like take it up to 0.8 or something like that. So now I can individually modify these things so that when I turn on my contour, You can see that it's darker, it's settled, but it's darker on the outside, and then this is slightly less. If I wanted to do that again, I could select all of these, change these to 0.5, and then, but you have to ungroup lines sometimes, and you have to also release compound paths. Okay, so this maybe looks actually pretty good. So what I want to do is, but the composition on the page I think would be more interesting if I rotated it. So I'm going to select everything and then come over to the corner until I get this rotation dialog, and now I'm just going to rotate everything, and this is just going to make it a little more interesting on the page. Something like that, and then zoom out, and I'm happy with that. I could experiment with rotating it more. I could change the scale of it if I wanted. Holding down on Shift, I could make things a little bigger or a little smaller proportionally. Something like that. That's looking pretty good. And I'm now going to hit save. And I will save this as image scan 1. And that's it. I could, now that this is saved as an Illustrator drawing, import these lines into Rhino, as like Rhino should read an Illustrator drawing. So that's, you can go from Rhino to Illustrator. And it's also useful to know that you can go from Illustrator to Rhino, because it might be useful at some point to use an image to generate line work and then bring that into your CAD model. So this concludes this tutorial. Have fun. And again, I've just shown you the very basic settings. And if you go back to the image, where was it? Image trace toolbar here, you should really play around with these settings because you can get all sorts of cool results. Also, by default, this advanced tab may be collapsed. So you can click on this down arrow to reveal some of the options that I used in the tutorial.